Last week we began a study of special providence, and we ended up last week looking at the promises made to Abraham, that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And again, those promises were fulfilled. The nation became Israel, the land was Canaan, and the seed was Christ. All those things came to fruition. All of them were done under the design that God made before the world began, and all the decisions and things that happened through the years and through the centuries didn't alter God's plan. He still brought it about just like he designed it. Ishmael and Isaac, Abraham's two sons. Ishmael was born to Hagar. In Genesis chapter 16, Abraham is 86 years old. He left Haran at 75, so it's been 11 years. He still doesn't have a son. So Sarah gets the bright idea to help God out and gives her handmaid Hagar to Abraham to be with his wife, so he can go into her and raise seed and have a descendant and have an heir. And so he takes her to wife, she does conceive, and she does bear a son, and his name is Ishmael. We read that in Genesis chapter 16. But God tells Abraham at that time that that is not the child of promise. That's not the one who the promise that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. It's not going to go through Ishmael. It's going through another son. And then Isaac would be born 1 year later in Genesis chapter 21. God promises that Abram and Sarah would have a son, and that son would be the child of promise, and that son would be Isaac. And that son would be the one that the promise made to Abraham would pass through to Isaac. And so, in Genesis 22, God tells him to take that son up on Mount Moriah and offer him for a sacrifice. And Abraham was going to do that. It was his test of faith, but God stopped him and said he knew that he trusted God and he believed God, and God used that test of faith in order to demonstrate Abraham's faithfulness and to understand that Isaac was going to live, because Isaac was the one who the promise was going to go through. Not through Hagar, not through Ishmael, but to Isaac. Now, just as a side note, who are the descendants of Ishmael? The Arabs, the Muslims. They are tied to Abraham, but to the son Ishmael. But Ishmael was not the child of promise. The child of promise was Isaac. And so that caused undue problems in the very beginning. She finally had to be sent away because Sarah began to treat her terribly. And so over a period of time, they were sent away. And so it caused problems then. And those descendants have been fighting since then, and will always fight, because they have two different ideologies and two understandings about the nature of God and about what he wants. But Ishmael and Isaac are the two sons of Abraham, but the one that the promise would go through was Isaac, not Ishmael. And then there were another set of brothers. Isaac has twin sons. They are Esau and Jacob. Esau is the older son, but in Genesis 25, beginning in verse 34 through 39, he sells his birthright for a bowl of beans, because he's been out hunting and he's famished. And Jacob is making some stew, and he sells his birthright. He said, what good is my birthright if I die? Again, Jacob wasn't going to let him die, but it just shows that he despised his birthright. Other translations say he despised his birthright. But when they were born, they were told when they were born that the younger would serve, the younger would rule over the older. That was told even before they were born. Now Jacob was the younger son who God chose in Genesis 25. Why did he choose Jacob over Esau? We can only know that because it was God's purpose. That was God's will. He knew both boys. He knew both men. He knew the heart of both individuals, and he chose Jacob over Esau. Now that didn't mean that he made Esau sell his birthright. He didn't. It didn't mean that God needed Jacob and Rebekah needed God's help to get the blessing from Isaac. He didn't need it. He did it, and that caused strife between Esau and him for many years. But God had a plan. And even with all this wrangling from Rebekah and Sarah and all these things that they tried to do to circumvent and help God out, it just made things worse, but it didn't change God's plan. That's why I want you to see, even though man acted contrary to God, it did not alter God's plan. And God didn't revise it, amend it, change it. Because of their disobedience, he still was going to carry that plan because he knew that they would be disobedient. He didn't make them be disobedient, but he knew their weak faith that they would. Now, Jacob has 12 sons. These are recorded in the book of Genesis. Genesis beginning in chapter 30 through about chapter 35. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and Issachar and Zebulun are born to his wife Leah. Then the handmaiden of Leah, Baali, draws 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. And Gad and Asher are born to Zephan, that's the handmaiden of Rachel. And then Rachel finally has 2 children, Joseph and Benjamin. Now these 12 sons make up the nation of Israel. These make up the nation of Israel. These 12 sons are going to be the essence of making the first promise given to Abraham. The nation promise is going to be fulfilled through those 12 tribes of Israel. They're going to become the nation of Israel. The 12 sons of Jacob are going to become the nation of Israel. Now the story of Joseph was not chosen on a whim. He ended up in Egypt. And he was a son. He was one of the younger sons of Abraham. Benjamin was the youngest, his brother. But Rachel was Joseph's mother, and he loved Joseph and made him a coat of many colors. And God gave him the ability to understand dreams and visions, and that caused his brothers to envy him. And the favoritism that his father showed toward Joseph caused his brothers to envy him, and finally sold him into slavery to the Ishmaelites. Again, that's interesting because that's the descendants of Abraham, because they're descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael. But even in there, he was sold then to Potiphar in Egypt, and everything he did, he prospered. Then Potiphar's wife tried to get him to lie with her and commit adultery. He rebuffed her advances and even ran out of the house, but she lied to her husband that he had tried to attack her, and in his anger he threw him into prison. But over a period of time, 2 years later, when Pharaoh has a dream and none of the wise men and counselors and soothsayers can understand it, then they remember about Joseph. The baker remembers, the butler remembers that Joseph had interpreted his dream in prison, that he lived and the baker died, and he tells the king, he says, Pharaoh, there's a man who's in your prison and he can tell you your dream. So they clean him up and bring him before Pharaoh, before Pharaoh, and he correctly tells him the dream and gives him the interpretation of the dream. That causes Pharaoh to put him in second in command in Egypt as they take the 7 years of plenty and store all the grain for the 7 years of famine that is coming. And then his brothers have to come down from Canaan in order to get grain because there's no food there in Canaan. And they don't recognize Joseph, but he recognizes them. And over a period of time, through testing them, Joseph testing them, they find out that he is Joseph. He reveals himself. And then he tells them to go get their father and to bring them back to the land of Egypt, especially the land of Goshen, and Joseph will take care of them. And that's indeed what happened. He acknowledges God's purpose in following Jacob's death. Now when Jacob died, the brothers thought that now Joseph's going to get even. For all the evil we did to him, now Joseph's going to get even. But if you read Genesis chapter 50, he says, am I in the place of God? It's not Joseph's place to punish his brothers. And he tells his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good to bring me here to save much people alive. You see, selling Joseph into slavery put Joseph in the right place in the right position of power in order to bring about God's people being brought to Egypt. And so when they're brought to Egypt for the next 17 years that Jacob lived, they were treated very favorably by the Egyptians because they respected Jacob. Now, Jacob dies, and Joseph dies, and that generation dies, and then the Bible tells us there arose a generation that did not know God. And the nation that did not know God, they put him in captivity. But God demonstrated his power over Pharaoh of Egypt, showed Pharaoh he wasn't in control, he didn't have the power. God had the power by bringing the 12 plagues. But then the 12 plagues, the 10 plagues happened to the Egyptians, and finally the last plague, the death of the firstborn, he finally relented and let them go. But then they got to the Red Sea, and when they were at the Red Sea, the Egyptians the Israelites were frightened and they wanted to go back, but Moses said, you stand still and you watch the salvation of the Lord. The enemy that you see, you'll never see him again. And so through the night, an east wind blew and the waters were parted, and they walked across the Red Sea on dry ground. And the Egyptians, who were so hot in pursuit of their anger of letting them go and the death of their children, they followed them in, and God, through Moses, brought the waters back together and destroyed them. And as they stood on the other side of the Red Sea, their enemy was destroyed, and they were free people, a free nation. God had kept promise number one. Israel was now a free nation, the nation that God had promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Now, that nation is going to have a home. But that nation that came out of Egypt, they didn't get to go in because that generation did not believe God. And when they had the opportunity to go to the promised land, after they surveyed it in the book of Numbers, they thought they were too mighty, the walled cities, the armies, the fences, the giants. They thought it was overwhelming. They couldn't defeat them, and they began to cry and to murmur, and God heard their cry and their murmur, and he caused that generation, every person that came out of Egypt, over 20 years old, died in the wilderness except Joshua and Caleb, because they were the faithful spies. Then we see in Joshua that God's going to keep promise number 2. God accomplished his purpose through the hardening of Pharaoh's heart to bring God's people out of Egypt and to lead them to where he wanted them to go. The Egyptian army was destroyed, as I just mentioned, at the Red Sea when the waters were parted. And the land was taken in the book of Joshua. We're going to read Joshua chapter 21, verse 43 through 45. Joshua chapter 21, verse 43 through 45. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And not a man of their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord God had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. Now you remember, when we read earlier last week, God made 3 promises to Abraham. The nation promise, and the land promise, and the seed promise. This is fulfillment of promise number 2. The land promise is now fulfilled. Now there are many people today who believe that that promise is yet to be fulfilled. Wrong. It has been fulfilled. We just read that all the land that God promised them, they took possession of it. And it says, all that God has said had come to pass. That means God has kept that promise. Now, there was no provision made that if they became disobedient and they were driven off the land, it was given back to their enemies, which God warned them that he would do in the book of Deuteronomy, if they disobeyed him and went into spiritual adultery and idolatry, which they did, and God destroyed them like he said he would. But there is not another promise that they would again redeem that land and be in the same position they were that they are now. God never promised that. He promised them the land. He gave them the land. He never promised to give it back to them after they lost it through the disobedience. And then we come to the period of Judges. It lasted more than 300 years. God used the surrounding nation to chastise his people. Here's how it went. They would become evil. They would follow other gods. They would go into idolatry. They would commit spiritual adultery. God would send a nation like the Moabites or the Ammonites to come in and to distress them and to provoke them and to put them under hard bondage. And then they would cry to God. God would hear their cry. He would send a deliverer in that would deliver the nation from the oppression. And they would be faithful as long as the judge lived. As soon as the judge died, they go back to their old tricks. God would send another nation to chastise them. And it went that way for 300 to 350 years. 15 judges, beginning with Othniel and Ian Samuel. 15 different judges God gave as deliverers. They would be faithful and they would fall back. In Judges 2 verse 10 it says there was no king in Israel, so each one did what was right in their own eyes. Since they didn't have any leadership, they didn't have any guidance, they had God but they weren't listening to him, and so they began to follow the dictates of their heart, and it led them into apostasy. In Judges 2 verse 16, nevertheless the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hands of those who plundered them. These judges were raised to deliver them from the enemy that had plundered them because of their disobedience. Chapter number 3 and verse 12. And the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. You see, God was punishing them. He was chastising them. Why? Because they had been disobedient, because they had been unfaithful. And God would chastise them, and then they would cry to God. After a period of time, he would hear their cry, and he would send another deliverer in. And this cycle just kept repeating itself for 15 different judges until we reach another period of time. And that is the period of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom lasted. God selected people. God's people decided they want a king. Samuel's old. His sons don't walk in his ways. But that's really not why they wanted a king. They wanted a king to be like other nations. They wanted a king to go out before them. They wanted a king to lead them. They wanted a king that would protect them. And again, I personally think they wanted a king to have somebody to blame. But be that as it may, God selected the first 3 kings that Israel had. The first was Saul in 1 Samuel 8, 9 through 16. The next was King David, 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. And the last was his son Solomon in 1 Kings 3, verse 8 through 12. Each of these kings reigned for 40 years. This is called the United Period. This is the zenith of Israel's history. This is when they were at the top and peak of their history. And it was 120 years, and they were united. Saul, he didn't have the faith. He just did what God said when he agreed with it. And when he did, he tried to justify it by blaming the people or blaming circumstance. David was the best king that Israel had. He was a man after God's own heart. He still had his own problem. He still had sin in his life that he had to deal with. But he was different than Saul, and when he was confronted with his sin, he repented. He didn't try to justify it. Solomon, he started out being a good king. He determined that he wasn't wise enough to lead God's people. He needed wisdom. So God was so blessed with what he asked for, he gave him greater wisdom than any man before him or any man after him. And all nations and people benefited from his wisdom except Solomon, because he did not apply it to himself. And at the end of his life, he was turning to mediums and witches and sorcery in order to try to find out what he needed to do, and they led his heart away from God. Well, that set up the next period of time, divided kingdom. Rehoboam's foolishness. Rehoboam is going to be the nation, the king's son, Solomon's son, and he's going to have 2 tribes that follow him, and there's going to be 10 that follow Jeroboam, because God told Solomon in his day that the kingdom would divide after his death. Rehoboam goes and asks the old heads, the wise, experienced leaders of Israel, how he should rule. They said, you know, your dad, he had a lot of building projects, he did a lot of different things, and he really taxed and put a great deal of burden on the people. You need to lighten up, and they'll love you and they'll serve you. Well, that was good advice. So then he asked his younger friends, how should he lead? They said, hey, you need to be even worse than your dad. You need to really make them serve with vigor. They need to understand. You need to put them under your thumb. Well, unfortunately, he chose to do the latter. He chose to put them under his thumb. And when they did, they revolted. And 10 tribes went with Jeroboam, who was a man of valor, a military person. And the other 2 went with Rehoboam, Judah, and Benjamin. And the kingdom divides. In 722, God brings Assyria 200 years after the split, approximately 205. God brings Assyria and destroys the northern kingdom, Israel. 135 years later, Judah did have better kings. She had a number of them, but she was destroyed by Babylon 135 years later, and that was because she followed the same ungodly path that Israel, her sister nation, had, and then ended the reign of the Davidic kings over the Davidic kings of the political kingdom. In Jeremiah 22, 29 to 30, there's a prophecy that no person of Coniah will ever sit on the throne of Israel again, and no king did. And 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 14, the death of David just before he died, God promised David that he would put one on the throne that would never abdicate his throne and would rule and reign forever. And that's the Lord, and that's the spiritual kingdom. In Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah prophesied of a kingdom that would not be political, but it would be spiritual, and it would have one ruler, and it would endure forever. Again, that is a reference to the church. Then you had the period of restoration. Jeremiah prophesied that they would return after 70 years of Babylonian captivity in Jeremiah 29, verse 10 through 14. God chose Cyrus, the king of Persia, to be the means of letting them out. What's interesting about this is decided hundreds of years before it takes place, and even before the Medes and Persians are in a position of authority as a world power. At the time of this prophecy, they weren't even in power. They weren't even a recognized nation. But this shows the difference in the prophecies of God and the prophecies of man. And Isaiah was right, because Cyrus did make a proclamation and let them go back and build their homeland. Ezra wrote about the prophecy fulfillment in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. And Nehemiah helped rebuild the walls and the gates of the city. In Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6, the Bible says the people had a mind to work. And in chapter 6 and verse 15, in 52 days, the walls and the gates were put up. But again, this was a remnant. This wasn't the whole nation. This was a remnant. This was a part of the nation that remained faithful even in captivity, but God caused them to rebuild. But not because that was going to be the permanent place, because he never took up residence in that new temple, because that wasn't going to be his home. His home was going to be under the new covenant. Now, God used Egypt to provide for and preserve the Hebrews, who would develop into a mighty nation of God's people. That great nation brought the seed. Galatians 3, 16 and 17, that seed in Christ. And in Exodus 3 through 12, we read that God was in control the whole time, even with all the disobedience that his children of Israel were making. Assyria, God gave Israel the land because he promised he would. Retaining it was conditioned on their obedience. In Joshua 23, God said, if you disobey me, I will remove you off the land that I gave you. And he did exactly what he said he would do. He captured the northern tribes and took them in captivity, according to 2 Kings 17 and verse number 5. Then Babylon was used, according to Habakkuk and Jeremiah and Daniel. They were used to punish Judah 135 years later when they went into Babylonian captivity. Habakkuk had a real tough time in understanding how he could use such a wicked nation as Babylon against his own people, and God's prophet was instructed because of disobedience. They're being punished. God's not, the nation of Babylon is going to pay for what it did too. And they would, 70 years, they would be destroyed and another nation would take their place. But God used them in order to punish his people because they had been disobedient. Judah was fully conquered in 586 BC. The Medo-Persian Empire used to execute judgment on the Babylonians in Jeremiah. Destroyed Babylon in 539 BC, at the end of the 70 years. Then you have the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great, we read about in the book of Daniel. His contribution to the Greek language, which became the universal language of the New Testament time. Then you have the Roman Empire, time period when God's kingdom began, according to the prophet Daniel in Daniel chapter 2. Contribution of roads and the highways made travel easier. Why was that important? Because when the early disciples were persecuted after the origin of the church began, they went everywhere preaching the word. That means the gospel was going throughout the world. Finally destroyed Judaism forever. In Matthew 24, Jesus predicted it, and it happened in 70 AD. Now, what about nations today? Jesus has all authority in heaven and earth, Matthew 28:18. God still controls civil government. He put it in place in order to protect those of us who are good and to punish the guilty. Destruction was God's judgment against wickedness. It always has been. Salt and light must remain. Even though we live in a dark, ungodly world, we must remain a positive influence for light and for direction by being obedient to God's will and to be the example and influence that we can lead people to the cross and to Christ. Now what can we conclude in all this? How does one account for the rise and fall of nations? How can nations today think they will escape God's wrath and judgment when they practice evil? Our nation needs to wake up. All the nations that oppose God and his teaching, whether they followed God, whether they were idolaters, it didn't matter. When they rebelled against God, they paid for it. Our nation will too if we don't correct our direction. God cannot be defeated. In Romans chapter 8, it says there's nothing above, there's nothing height, width, or depth that can defeat God. In Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, and our faith has overcome the world. What we need to remember in special providence, and here's what I want you to remember. God had a plan. That plan went about exactly like God said it would. He brought it all off, even with all the disobedience, even with all the rebellion of God's people and the rebellion of other nations. God used every decision that man made as a stepping stone to get to the plan that fulfilled the land, the seed, and the nation promise that would eventually lead us to Christ, through whom he would redeem sinful men. How did he do it? He did it through the choices of man's free will and through special providence of using things at his disposal by their decision to bring about his will. That is special providence.